Footage was taken of some of these incidents, and it went viral on the internet.
The video depicted an alarming scene in which the men of the village were in a state of panic, discharging their firearms into the jungle in the dark of night.
And they were saying that they were being attacked by the face peelers. And some of them said that they were being attacked by aliens. And so ultimately I resolved to go and investigate myself. Again, nobody was going. The villagers were desperate. They were asking for the Navy. Again, they were pleading the government to protect them against this threat. I interviewed dozens and dozens of the villagers, and they all told me the same story. Many of them had seen the assailants. Many of them were up close, just a few feet away from them, discharged their shotguns at them. There was no question in my mind that these villagers had experienced a real phenomenon. They were not making this up. This is not people imagining things. This is technology being deployed in the jungle. Now, who's deploying the technology? I don't know. I suspect it's human. I don't think it's aliens. Are they really interested in peeling faces? I don't think so, because with all this technology at their disposal, whoever these people are, they really suck at peeling faces. So what's going on? I think that somebody's using the face peeler legend as cover for something else going on.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of The Resilient Show, and I am here in Bozeman, Montana with Tim Alberino. If you guys have not followed Tim's work, I hope you will now, because I have to say I'm so excited for a lot of episodes, but when I started The Resilient Show, I had a top 10 list of the people I want to interview most, and Tim, you were on that list. And so sitting here with you right now, I'm super pumped, man.
Well, it's my pleasure to be with you.
Well, we worked together on my upcoming show, Shadow Figures, which I can't say where it's going to be, but it's going to be on a major network. And you were just instrumental in our episode with going down to Bimini.
The Bimini Road.
The Bimini Road, and looking at megalithic structures. And you're widely known for being an expert in megalithic structures, but also your book, Birthright. I just got done. I've read several chapters twice because they're just so fascinating to me. And it's incredible. It's an incredible book that I think every Christian needs to read. First of all, I think every Christian needs to read it, but I think it's something that everyone, Christian or non-Christian, needs to read this book, because it implicates so much of our history, our culture, the planet that we live on, and the universe that we live in. It just brings in so many perspectives that most people in the faith world never talk about.
I appreciate you saying that.
So I loved it, man. I really do. I want to just jump right into, because you have a fascinating life, especially what you do now, but it started off as a teenager, just packing up and going down to Peru. Like, what led you to be prompted to just take off as a teenager and move down to the jungles of Peru?
Well, I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, specifically in Brook Park, Ohio, which was kind of a lower middle class working neighborhood, blue collar. I had a great upbringing. My father was a pastor, but I was bored out of my mind in Brook Park, Ohio. And I've always had this desire for adventure, this yearning for adventure. And so when I was 18 years old, ultimately, when I was 18 years old, I dropped out of high school, or kind of got kicked out of high school, but not because of bad behavior. It's a long story. And I ended up in Peru. I ended up moving to the Amazon. And I guess I should say that I went to Peru by route of England, of Gatwick, London, where I was deported, because I flew to London first. One of my big dreams growing up was to go to Scotland and Ireland. And without going into all the details, after I dropped out of high school, I raised some money. I made some money, and my best friend and we set off for England with the intention of going up to Scotland and then over to Ireland. But again, I won't get into all the details, but we were deported the day after we arrived to London. We landed in the London Gatwick airport. We got pulled aside by the immigrations officer, interviewed, interrogated, and basically I got called a Yankee. She called me a Yankee and deported us the next day. But had I not been deported from London, I would have never gone to Peru. Because when I came home, of course, I was super bummed because I felt like I couldn't get out of Brook Park, Ohio. And it just so happened that the next Sunday or a couple of Sundays later, there was a Mexican-American preacher, a missionary rather, preaching in my dad's church. His name was Alfonso Felix. And my stepmom, who had been to Peru, said, you need to go to Peru. Go with Alfonso. Go to Peru with Alfonso. So long story short, I ended up going to Peru with Alfonso. So had I not been deported from England, I would have never went to Peru. So I think it was Providence that brought me to Peru. And
because now you spent a big chunk of your life down there.
Yeah, I ended up living there for about 10 years. Two of my boys were born there in Tarapoto, Peru, which is in the Amazon basin. It's a jungle city.
Getting down there in the beginning, it started off for ministry. What led you to looking at the cultures, history, architecture?
So I traveled extensively around Peru, and I encountered a lot of the history of Peru, a lot of the archaeological stuff, legends of giants. I heard legends of giants, and that's really where my interest began.
Because when you see it, you can't. I've been down, short trip to Lima, went out to Cusco, and went down to Machu Picchu. When you see it, something like that up close, it just doesn't make sense to you. Not with the knowledge that we have.
Yeah, I was definitely deeply impacted the first time that I saw a megalithic wall.
Yeah.
And I knew that it seemed to me that we were missing a chunk of our history, and that, or at the very least, that there were things that we didn't understand about the past, that our antecedents were much more remarkable than we've given them credit for. And the Inca Empire, the Inca themselves were remarkable, but I don't believe that the Inca built the megaliths. And there's many reasons why I say that, but yeah, my first encounter with megaliths was very impactful.
Being down there in the areas you've been to in the jungle, you've had some crazy stories. One of them that you talk about is the face peelers.
Yeah. So the face peeler phenomenon, that happened a couple of years ago, and they call them face peelers, pelacaras in Spanish, or pistacos. This is a legend that goes back to the mid-'80s, but no further back than that. It started in the mid-'80s. And the indigenous people in Peru, in the jungle specifically, they would talk about this phenomenon, these face peelers, the pelacaras, and occasionally there would be incursions of these, whoever they are, these assailants, into their villages, and they would abduct individuals, and those individuals would later be found with their faces partially or entirely peeled off. And peeled off really isn't the right way. Right way to say it, rather surgically removed. The faces are surgically removed. And sometimes, apparently, there was organ harvesting happening as well. And again, this is a legend that goes back to the 80s, and the indigenous people, depending on which community you're talking to or which individual in that community you're talking to, some people will say that these are aliens because apparently they have very advanced technology. And others will say that they're gringos, organ harvesting gringos.
Right.
And so a couple of years ago, there was a face peeler flap that happened, and it was affecting the district of Nanay primarily in the Peruvian Amazon. And Nanay is in the region of Iquitos, and there were several communities up in the Nanay district that were being attacked. And footage was taken of some of these incidents, and it went viral on the internet. And it was very mysterious. The villagers were obviously frightened, and they were pleading for help from the government, specifically from the Navy, to come protect them. And they were saying that they were being attacked by the face peelers. And some of them said that they were being attacked by aliens. And apparently these assailants had remarkable capabilities. They could float through the jungle. They were impervious to gunfire. They could fly up into the air. They could accelerate up into the sky, and various sci-fi type attributes that led some of the villagers to think they were dealing with aliens. So what's really ironic is at the time when this broke out, by the way, this broke out in, I think it was 2023. I can't remember if it was 2022, 2023, but it broke out in the month of July and then into August. But the entire month of July, there were face peeler accounts of face peeler encounters coming from various parts of the Peruvian Amazon. And there was one individual who showed up, who was discovered. His body was recovered, and 3/4 of his face were surgically removed. And I published that on my YouTube channel. It got age restricted by YouTube, but there was all kinds of UFO.
So you had put the picture out.
I put the video out, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And the police are pulling him up the bank of a river, and clearly his face is surgically removed. 3/4 of it. It wasn't depredation. It was not. It was not piranhas or something, because it was extremely clean. I mean, it looked like it was laser. The part of his face was cut off with a laser. And again, there was widespread UFO activity happening. Mm-hmm. Apparently hostile UFO activity, reminiscent of the Colares incident that happened back in Brazil years ago, decades ago. So at this time, ironically, I didn't have my passport. I had sent my passport in to get renewed. And a lot of people were asking me if I would go down there and investigate, because nobody was going to these villages. And this was all over the Peruvian press, by the way. And I was kind of glad that I didn't have my passport, because I didn't really want to go. And I thought, okay, well, by the time I get my passport down, by the time I get my passport back, this is all going to blow away. It's all going to settle down. And I got my passport back about a month later, and the situation had not calmed down at all. In fact, it was burgeoning. And so ultimately I resolved to go and investigate myself, because again, nobody was going. The villagers were desperate. They were asking for the Navy. Again, they were pleading, making videos and taking pictures of them holding up signs and beseeching the government to protect them against this threat. And the villagers were patrolling every night, and there was an attempted abduction of a young girl named Talia. And there was a video specifically from the village of San Antonio de Pintuyacu, which is up the river Pintuyacu, way out, very, very remote. In fact, this is the last civilization outpost before you just encounter a vast tract of uninhabited wilderness, jungle. And so ultimately I mounted this expedition, and I tagged a friend of mine named Doug Thornton to go with me. And Doug was an infantry Marine, was also a DHS operator. And we took equipment down there. We supplied the village with food and medical supplies, because they were running out of food and medical supplies, because the men, instead of going out to their fields to work in what they call their chakras, their little farms, they were just guarding their village day and night. And so we brought them, again, some supplies. We also brought them some technology, some night vision goggles and radios and various technological implements. And I mean, long story short, we could talk for 3 hours about this. Long story short, I interviewed dozens and dozens of the villagers, San Antonio de Pintuyacu. And they all told me the same story. Many of them had seen the assailants. Many of them were up close, just a few feet away from them, discharged their shotguns at them. I interviewed Talia, the girl who was being abducted. She was being abducted, and then she was able to scream, and her assailants left her, but they were going to cut her face. And there was no question in my mind that these villagers had experienced a real phenomenon. They were not making this up.
Right.
All of their stories were coordinated in the sense that they all saw the same thing. They all collectively, corporately experienced, right, they were all consistent. They all experienced the same phenomenon. And basically what they described to me were very tall individuals. They said they were at least my height, and I'm about 6'1", but most of them said they were taller than me, significantly taller than me. Some people said they were 7 feet tall or 7.5 feet tall, and that they would when they would make these incursions into the village, they would come flying on these discs, these hoverboards, and they were silent, and so they would see them flying above the village. They would just see these, because they were illuminated around the perimeter. They would see these like little mini flying saucers, and then some of the guys in the village were able to flash their flashlights onto these saucers, and they would see individuals, the silhouettes of individuals, sort of surfing on these things, and these assailants would always come 2 by 2, and they would fly over the village and land in the jungle, and then they would walk into the village, or some people said float into the village, and they were dressed in armor bodysuits from head to foot. They had helmets on, and the helmets, all the villagers told me, that the ones that saw them up close, that they had these almond-shaped eye lenses on their helmets. Some of the villagers said that they were illuminated green, and others like a yellow or gold. Maybe night vision, I don't know. But clearly their body armor was unaffected by the shotgun blast. 16 gauge shotguns, birdshot.
Right.
But the villagers actually, when they realized that the birdshot was having no effect, they would hear it dink off the body armor. One individual shot one of these guys at close range. I talked to him, and he swore, by the way, the body armor was black, almost like some sort of a stealth technology. But one of the villagers swore to me it was silver, that the one he shot was silver. He was wearing silver body armor. And he said he shot at close range, and the guy was floating. The assailant was floating. And he said there were these lights on the bottom of his shoes, on the bottom of his boots, and he wasn't on a disc. He was just floating 3 feet off the ground through this technology that was incorporated into his boots. And he shot him at close range, the villager, and it knocked the guy back on his butt, the assailant. He just popped right back up. And he said he heard the birdshot dinking off of the body armor. It knocked the guy down, and he just popped back up and escaped, basically. And I heard dozens and dozens of stories like this. The villagers chased these guys through the jungle on one occasion. They said that one of the villagers told me that the way that they moved was inhuman. That was his words. It was inhuman. There was some confusion about jetpacks because, the media said these were miners, river miners with advanced jetpack technology. That's nonsense. Absolutely not. They did have backpacks, but the propulsion technology was in their boots and their discs. So they flew into the village on the discs, but then they also had some sort of propulsion technology on their boots. So the backpacks, we surmised that the backpacks were battery. They were the
power source.
Maybe batteries, maybe small reactors, the power source. But there was even a case in a different village. I talked to an individual named Pablo, and it was I'm trying to remember. There was a guy on X who contacted me. I'm trying to think of the name of his X account. I think it was Peru Alien Attacks. But he sent me the contact information to a guy named Pablo who had an encounter with these guys in a different village, in a homestead, in a different part of the jungle. And Pablo actually tackled one of these assailants, or tried to.
Yeah.
He shot him up close with birdshot, and he thinks he damaged the technology because the guy was trying to lift off the ground, and he couldn't get off the ground. And so Pablo ran up and grabbed him, like as if he was going to tackle him right around the waist. And he said this assailant pulled out some kind of a laser and hit him with the laser, and Pablo went unconscious. And then he had heart tremors. The electrical timing of his heart was off, and he had to go get, I think, a pacemaker after that. So, these are very visceral encounters. These aren't imagined encounters. And all the different areas of the jungle where this was happening, all the villagers reported the same thing. Same thing, same phenomenon. And in fact,
in different tribes.
Different communities, indigenous communities, and then like cities were attacked as well. The city of Nauta, which has, I think it has 36,000 inhabitants. So it's not a little remote village. This is a city. And Nauta has a military presence. The Navy's there, the Army's there, they have helicopters, they have Navy boats, and they were being assaulted by the same phenomenon. And I interviewed people in Nauta. Apart from the hoverboards, the circular hoverboard technology, apparently the assailants were also in possession of what I would describe as advanced aerospace vehicles. Multiple people in the village. In fact, they drew it for me. I have on my YouTube channel, I produced a video about this. I did a little documentary. And you'll see in the video a villager drawing, one of the villagers is drawing in the dirt what these advanced aerospace vehicles look like. And they're basically, and then another guy on an acrylic chalkboard drew the same thing. They look like an acorn shaped, but more pointed at the front. Like, so basically delta shape, but more like, something like an acorn, but on its side, right?
Right.
And at least, I interviewed at least a half a dozen villagers who saw this thing. And it was this craft that would hover silently above the village. And it was, the size of a large helicopter. So like the size of like a Chinook helicopter. And it would just hover there silently. And some of the villagers said it was like matte black. But one guy said he had a close encounter with it. He said it was transparent. You could see a mesh, like you could see the body of the craft, the fuselage, but it was like mesh. It was transparent. And you could see two guys inside of it. Two of these assailants were inside of it. And he had a close encounter. It was right above him when he was pulling up his nets in the river. So this is not people imagining things. This is technology being deployed in the jungle. Now, who's deploying the technology? I don't know. I suspect it's human. I don't think it's aliens. But Talia, the girl that was almost abducted, she had a very close encounter with these assailants. And she says that they were speaking in Spanish, and one of them had a gringo accent, and one of them had a Peruvian, didn't have an accent. He spoke like a Peruvian. As I said earlier, they were going to cut her face off, and they started to make an incision under her jawline, and there's footage of the scar that she has. And thank God she was able to break loose. They had her mouth covered, and they lost control of her for a minute, and she screamed. And this wasn't the first incursion, so the villagers were already in a state of vigilance. So when they heard her scream, they came running with their flashlights and shotguns, and they saw, several of the villagers saw Talia laying on the ground, bloodied up from the incision, and these two assailants hovering on their boards. And then when the villagers approached them, they shot up into the sky at a high rate of speed. So it was very real. It was not imagined. Multiple villages were affected by it. Not just villages, the city of Nauta with a military presence.
Yeah.
So, and the reason why I stress that is because the news came out and said, even News Nation got this wrong. They never reached out to me for comment, but they got this wrong. They believed the story that it was jetpack miners, river miners with state-of-the-art jetpack technology. Absurd. It wasn't miners. It wasn't jetpack technology. And they were saying that, the narrative was that the miners, because they had done this in the past in Peru and in Brazil, the miners would try and scare the indigenous people off of their land so that they could mine the river.
Right.
And they mine the river and move on. So they only have to scare the indigenous people off for a short period of time. That's not what this was. Again, because they attacked the people living in Nauta. This is not a soft target. Nauta is not a soft target. 36,000 inhabitants. And on the outskirts of Nauta, there was a boy actually, and I put this in my video. There was a boy from the village of Bagasan, which is not far from Nauta, who was attacked, and shortly before we got there actually. And in Peru, in these third world countries, as you probably know, if there's a car accident or a shooting, they don't censor anything. They put the whole graphic thing on TV. And so they published a report in Peru of this. I think he was like 13, maybe he was 10, 12, 13. He was sitting in a clinic. They had rescued him, and he looked like he had gills cut into right under his jawline, just flapping there, just bleeding, and he was in shock.
Yeah.
It wasn't even blurred. I mean, they just put the whole thing out on TV in Peru. So he was attacked, and he says he was attacked by face peeler. So what's going on here? I mean, are they really interested in peeling faces? I don't think so, because with all this technology at their disposal, whoever these people are, they really suck at peeling faces.
Yeah.
They didn't get the job done with Talia. They got one guy that was found in the river, and this kid, they weren't able to take his face either, because that was interrupted.
Right.
Villager, that was the same sort of situation. Some of the villagers came to this boy's aid, and the assailants got away. So what's going on? I think that somebody's using the face peeler legend as cover for something else going on. There was, interestingly enough, during this period of time, there was a joint operation led by the United States called Resolute Sentinel, happening in Peru. And it involved various nations, including the United States, Peru, Brazil, Uruguay, believe Ecuador, the United Kingdom, and a handful of other nations were involved in this joint exercise. We had deployed in Peru for Resolute Sentinel the Army, the Navy, the Marines, Space Force, the Air Force, the Coast Guard. We had all of these different branches of the military involved, and the equivalents from the United Kingdom and Peru and these other nations. And it was during this period of time there was crossover.
Right.
During which these assets were in Peru, and the face peeler phenomenon, flap, started to occur. There was crossover in early July. And so I wonder if Resolute Sentinel was a cover for a legitimate operation happening in the jungle. I don't believe, no, some people do that I know and are in the military, and I've talked to many people who've contacted me and given me some insight into the situation. Some of these individuals believe that it was either elements of the United States military or contractors who were testing some technology or whatever, right, or maybe some guys that went rogue. I don't think so. If anything, and I don't know if this is the case at all, but if anything, maybe Resolute Sentinel was a cover for a real op that was happening in the jungle to go after these guys. Maybe this was a rogue group, and they had all this technology, and we were putting assets in the jungle, right? We were
to try to catch them, yeah.
Yeah, like or maybe like a Predator scenario, like a Predator movie where you had some sort of weird phenomenon happening, and we deployed assets out there. So if you're going to do that, obviously, if you don't want to raise attention, if you don't want to raise awareness,
make it a training exercise.
Make it a training exercise,
yeah.
Right?
Which has consistently happened.
Right, and then you can have all kinds of Air Force assets and Navy assets, and nobody will bat an eye because Resolute Sentinel is underway, right?
Yeah.
And the Peruvian government is central to this thing, so the Peruvian military wouldn't think anything of it, and we could go and do covert operations in the jungle. Nobody would ever know.
No one would ask any questions.
So I think that the face peeler phenomenon was a cover for the bad guys. Mm-hmm. They wanted the Peruvian press and the Peruvians themselves to think that this was just that legend, and so it would be dismissed.
Right.
And it was largely dismissed in the beginning, but then it was taken really seriously when it was apparent that this was real and the villagers were desperate. And then came the narrative of the miners with advanced state-of-the-art jetpacks.
Which is completely...
It was two police officers from Iquitos who, these were the only guys who went to the village of San Antonio de Pintuyacu before I arrived. And they had a Navy escort, but it was the two police officers who did this investigation. They really did. The villagers, they didn't do an investigation. They talked to the villagers, and then they determined that this had to be miners, river miners with jetpacks. That's where that story came from, and everybody ran with it. But it was a lie.
Because it was easy.
It was easy.
Yeah.
And they had to go investigate, by the way, because there was an attempted abduction
Right.
with physical evidence. So they had to go investigate. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone. So then, we went. And that situation, by the time we got there in October, the whole thing had died down. The villagers had not experienced an incursion for about a month. And have not, I've been in contact with them ever since, and have not had an incursion since we were there. So the phenomenon had already subsided. We left them with technology, and Doug and a couple of Peruvian Navy guys that I brought with me, they trained the villagers while we were there, the men, to do proper patrols. They divided the village up into sectors. We gave them really good radios and high-powered flashlights and night vision goggles and all that. And they actually trained these guys to do a proper patrol.
Yeah.
And while we were there, we spent a couple nights in the village, 3 days, 2 nights. While we were there, they were actually doing the patrols properly. It was really impressive. They took it very seriously, these guys.
Yeah.
People always ask me, so I want to say it. Aside from the other supplies that we brought the villagers, we did bring them ammunition.
Okay.
Everyone always asks me, why didn't you bring them ammunition? We did.
Okay. Wasn't just birdshot.
Yes, it wasn't just, well, they were taking their birdshot because when they realized that it was ineffective against the body armor, they would open up the cartridge and they would take the BBs and melt them together to make larger BBs, right? To make slugs, basically. And in fact, they set up traps around the village, tripwires. They do this to hunt game, small game.
Yeah.
And they usually have them only about a foot off the ground, but they elevated them to estimating the knee height of these guys. And they set 9 traps up around the village, and the traps would go off at night. But then when they would run out there to see, they would see the footprints of the assailants. And the footprints, by the way, were not like boot impressions.
Right.
They were 2 discs, little discs. So there was some sort of technology on the bottom of their boots, and it was like 2 discs. And they would never, the guns would go off. And they weren't guns, they were tubes with like a hammer mechanism, right? Traps, trip line. And they never caught any assailants. But unfortunately, right before we got there, there was a woman who accidentally walked into one of the traps and it had shot her in the thigh.
Oh man.
And she had to be taken to the hospital.
Yeah.
But that just illustrates how serious the situation was. This was not fantasy land.
It was such a big story, but I think the average person hears something like that, I think it's crazy. And I mean, you talk about face peelers, advanced technologies, UFOs, extraterrestrials. I think through the course of this interview, we're going to find a lot of those things: angels, demons, all this stuff that you talk about. And I think all those things, including UFOs, you believe the Bible has an explanation for most of these things.
would say, I'm not sure I would say that the Bible has an explanation for all these things. Rather, what I would say is these things are not contradictory to the biblical narrative if you have the proper perspective.
I'm going to read one of the things that I wrote down that you said. You said, you call the Bible a coded communication to mankind from the creator of the universe and a message system from a source outside of time.
An integrated message system. That's actually a quote from the late Chuck Missler.
Okay.
He used to refer to the Bible as an integrated message system from outside of time, or something to that effect. And what he means by that is the Bible is a coded message to mankind. And it's an integrated system to where the message is in every book of the 66 books of the Bible. You can find that the same message in every book of the Bible. And that there's this consistent narrative. And I completely agree with that. And like I said, it's not that, I study all manner of strange things. Bigfoot, for example.
Right.
I'm interested in all those, the cryptid stuff, UFOs, obviously stuff like the face peelers, megaliths, ancient civilizations. And it's not that you can find chapter and verse explanations for these things.
Right.
And that's not what I'm looking for. The Bible doesn't inform us about everything. In fact, the Bible is very limited in what it informs us about. It didn't, it doesn't tell us about the internet or internal combustion, automobiles and airplanes and any of that. Rather, what it does is it frames our worldview. And so that's what I mean. You can have a perspective, a biblical perspective, in which all of this various phenomena can be comfortably accommodated into that paradigm. And you can have a biblical paradigm anchored in the gospel of Christ. I believe ardently in the gospel of Christ. None of that is affected by any of these other realities. The existence of Bigfoot, the existence of an alien presence, UFOs. None of these realities affect they don't affect my paradigm, and they certainly have no bearing on the gospel of Christ.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Some of the things that I want to touch on, a couple of things as we set the stage for where I want to go with this is one, the age of the earth. Oftentimes, I think Christians especially will challenge their biblical view or even the view of creation with the age of the earth. There's short earth theorists and people that believe the earth's been here millions of years. And then also some people believe that humans have been here. In fact, the genealogy of the Bible would suggest between 6,000 and 7,000 years. Maybe, I'm guessing.
Depending on if you're using the Masoretic text or the Septuagint.
Okay, so is it a pretty broad range, or?
Well, the Masoretic text, for some reason, we're talking about the Genesis 5 genealogy.
Yes.
The Masoretic text, the Masoretes subtracted 100 years from the lifespans of each antediluvian patriarch.
Okay.
Why they did that, I don't know. So, if you are using the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that the early church was using, the Greek-speaking early church, then what you have is a something like 1,200 additional years, something like that, 1,500 additional years, something like that. When you compare the Septuagint, Genesis 5 and the Septuagint to the Genesis 5 genealogy and the Masoretic text. Masoretic text is what we all have in our Bibles.
Right.
So, but I personally think that the Genesis 5 genealogy does not give us an accurate timeline. Why? Why do I say that? Because there's this phenomenon called telescoping. And telescoping is when you take a very long genealogy and you truncate it, you shorten it, you telescope it, right? And this is, by the way, this is the rule and not the exception in the Bible in regard to genealogies.
Okay.
The majority of them are telescoped. And the reason why they do that was because our society, we're very practical thinkers. We're very scientific thinkers in our modern society. But in the ancient world, they didn't think the way that we do today. So they were thinking more about symbolism and messaging. And so the reason why the biblical writers would telescope a genealogy was because they wanted the genealogy to amount to a particular number. 10, 40, 70, these biblical numbers that were very important. And the number itself is symbolic. It's part of the message. So that's why they would telescope the genealogy. They would remove certain individuals so that they could hit that number in the head count of the for example, the pre-flood patriarchs. So as I said, telescoping is the rule and not the exception in the Bible. So somebody who approaches the Genesis 5 genealogy and wants to say that this is an accurate accounting of how many years there were from Adam to the flood they have the burden of proof.
Right.
Because this would be the exception to the rest of the genealogies in the Bible. So I believe that this is an accurate accounting of the pre-flood patriarchs, but that it's more than just a mathematical count of days or of years from Adam to the flood. Rather, I think that this is a message. It's a coded message. The number is significant. It's symbolic. Those were, in fact, the pre-flood patriarchs, but there may be some missing.
Sure.
And so I personally believe that there's many, many more years between Adam and the flood than most Christians are accustomed to reckoning. As I said, there's definitely many, many more years, at least 1,000 more years if you reckon the genealogy according to the Greek Septuagint. This is well known by scholars. So it's by no means, the matter is by no means settled in the scholarly community. Now, among lay people, your average churchgoer is under the assumption that if they're a young earth creationist, for example, that this is ironclad. Obviously, there was only this many years between the flood and Adam because the Bible says X, Y, Z. But it's not that cut and dry. In fact, there are many issues like that in the Old Testament.
What would they believe? They would believe about 2,500 years between Adam and the flood.
I'm not sure what the exact number of years it works out to be, but approximately 6,000 years ago was right. Adam, was the creation of mankind. That's what young earth creationists believe. And they believe that the creation of Adam corresponded to the creation of the earth. In other words, that the earth was created nearly simultaneously with Adam.
Yeah, and I think you and I, at least I think, I'm not speaking for you, would agree that even if the earth was millions of years old, that wouldn't contest the fact that humans came later.
No, the age of the earth is honestly
irrelevant to the age.
It's irrelevant to the message of the gospel of Christ, that's for sure. For sure. It doesn't matter how old the earth is, and it doesn't matter how long mankind has been on the earth. The gospel of Christ is true regardless. And so it really kind of surprises me how worked up Christians get about this topic.
Very dogmatic on this topic.
Very dogmatic. Yeah. And I have a lot of respect for young earth creationists. I think there's a lot of brilliant young earth creationists who make a very strong case for a young earth. I don't think it's illogical. I don't think it's irrational. I think they make a good case. I just think the case for an old earth is better. Yeah. And makes more sense and is more rational. And at least from my perspective. But again, it really doesn't make a difference to me. It doesn't make a difference to me how you interpret the first verses of Genesis. If you believe in a literal 6-day creation, or if you believe in, like the astrophysicist Hugh Ross, if you believe in seasons of creation, epochs of creation, six epochs of creation. Like, to me, it doesn't really matter.
It's not foundational to the gospel. To me, I agree.
It doesn't change that integrated messaging system that we were talking about. And that messaging system, by the way, exists to convey the gospel of Christ. That's the primary purpose of it. That's the primary purpose. It does more. The corpus of biblical texts does more than convey the gospel of Christ, but that's the primary purpose of the 66 books of the Bible.
The centerpiece for the entire Bible is the coming of Christ.
Right. And I mean, to put it bluntly, without Jesus Christ, without Jesus of Nazareth, the Old Testament is just a storybook. It's just an interesting historical document. Yeah. If you take Christ out of this thing, then you lose the message. That is the message. The Son of God, in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and the gospel of Christ and the mission of Christ, that is the primary message of the Bible. So I approach the age of the earth and the flood of Noah and some of these things in a much more, I have a much more flexible paradigm than a lot of Christians. As you said, many Christians are locked into dogma. It's very, very rigid. And they all think that they're right. I mean, this is why we have like, what is it? I think it's 30,000 different Protestant denominations.
Yeah, and it divide over these topics.
I don't know if that number is accurate, but there's thousands. There's thousands of different Protestant denominations and the reason why these denominations have splintered is because they all hold different positions on various theological points, right? So there is no uniform consensus among Christians apart from Christ. And even there, you have Trinitarians and Unitarians and all different kinds of perspectives on different theological issues. But the point is, people are under the assumption that these things are concrete when they're not. Mm-hmm. They're not as concrete as people think. Again, referring to the age of the earth, referring to the Genesis 5 genealogy, referring to the flood of Noah. The flood happened, but the details about the flood are not as concrete as people think.
So when people talk about things like science, religion, I think you and I agree that those things don't contradict each other, to complement each other.
Again, the purpose of the biblical corpus is to convey the gospel of Christ. So I don't expect the Bible. It does sometimes, but I don't expect it to inform me about physics, for example. And there's a good way to illustrate this point. The very Son of God was here among us. According to the Bible, all things were created through him, Jesus, and for him. And in him all things consist. And he is before all things. And he's here with us. He's walking through Judea, preaching, interacting with people, right? Mm-hmm. And what is he preaching? What is he telling them? He's telling them about the kingdom of heaven. And he's healing the sick. And he's telling them about his Father. And he doesn't bother to tell them about the germ theory of disease. Mm-hmm. He doesn't bother to tell them about electricity. He doesn't tell them, hey, you guys are using torches and you can't see at night, but there's this thing called electricity. Yeah. He doesn't upgrade their knowledge, their scientific knowledge at all. At all. And he could have. He knows everything.
Sure.
Right? He could have upgraded their medical knowledge at the very least. He could have walked into the hospital or wherever the sick were being cared for in Judea, in Jerusalem, and instructed the physicians on how to treat these patients properly. He didn't. He wasn't concerned with any of that. In fact, he talked to the people as if they were children with parables. And parables are forms of allegories. A parable is a form of allegory. So he spoke to them allegorically, mm-hmm. and his whole purpose was to convey to them the gospel of the kingdom. And he did it effectively. He did it so effectively that you could take a New Testament and hand it to an 8-year-old, and that 8-year-old could read through the New Testament and completely understand what the gospel of Christ is, based on the words of Christ and then the further elucidation of the writers of the New Testament, the disciples. So if the Son of God didn't bother to teach us physics, if he didn't bother to upgrade our scientific knowledge, then I don't expect the Bible to do that for us either. Right. And rather, as I've said 100 times already, what I expect the Bible to do is to convey a message, mm-hmm. and to do so in whatever form it necessary. Allegory, metaphor, all manner of figures of speech, historical accounts, prophecy, all of these things are modes of communication to mankind. And so that's why I don't believe that nature, because there's, as Hugh Ross says, the astrophysicist who I cited earlier, that there's two books. There's the written word of God, the Bible, mm-hmm. and then there's the book of nature. And those things don't contradict. And I completely agree with that.
Okay. Yeah.
Because nature came into existence through the Word of God.
Mm-hmm.
And who's the Word of God, according to the writers of the New Testament? The Son of God is the Word of God. So the very universe itself came into existence through the Son of God. And the Bible that we carry around in our hands is the message of the Son of God. So you have the book of nature, and then you have the scriptures. And then they don't contradict.
But yeah, I agree. The one of the issues that I have had with outspoken Christians on this topic is that humans are like the center of creation, the center of the universe. That in a solar system and an infinite galaxies and universe with trillions and infinite amount of stars and no beginning and end of time, that we are the center, we are the center focus of creation, and that there could possibly not even possibly be intelligent life out there anywhere. I have a real fundamental problem.
That's called the anthropocentric perspective of the universe, and it's exactly what you say. It's anthropocentric, meaning man-centered, human-centered. And that is the prevailing view among Christians. And I refer to that as a medieval perspective.
Okay.
It's not the biblical perspective. The biblical perspective is clearly a Christocentric perspective of the universe. Christ is at the center of all things, not us. This isn't our story. This is his story. We are ancillary characters, secondary characters in his story. Mm-hmm. That's the proper biblical perspective. So if you imagine like the universe as a wheel, mm-hmm. and like a wagon wheel, and you have the hub at the center of the wheel, the hub of the wheel, that's where all the spokes on this wagon wheel connect to. And in the anthropocentric perspective, we are at the center of that wheel. Everything happening in the universe and all the conscious players in this story, mm-hmm. all the conscious actors in this story, their purpose is related to us because we're at the center of the wheel. That, in my estimation, is unbiblical. If you remove mankind and you make us one of the spokes on the wheel, and instead you place Christ at the center of that wheel, that's the proper biblical perspective. That is certainly the doctrine of the writers of the New Testament. Christ is all and in all. He is the center of all things. And again, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist.
Yes.
It is a Christocentric universe. It's his universe. We are a spoke on that wheel. Now, we're very important. That's not to diminish mankind.
Right.
We're so important that God sent his only begotten Son to die for us, to redeem us, and so that we could be reconciled to the Father and restored to the family of God. That's how important we are. But we're not the purpose. We're not the center of the universe. That's Christ. And if we make ourselves the center of the universe, then we usurp the Son of God. And it's because of the anthropocentric perspective that so many Christians are stuck in this very rigid paradigm into which you cannot accommodate all of these various realities.
That's kind of what I was getting at, where it feels like if you have that perspective that you and I share, then all these other things don't matter.
They don't matter anymore.
They don't contradict.
They don't matter because it's not our story. It's his story.
Yeah.
This whole thing, the universe wasn't created for mankind. Let's put it this way. The universe wasn't created for the earth, and the earth wasn't created for mankind. It was all created for Jesus, for the Son of God.
And in fact, you say this great in your book, Birthright. You talk about humans, this eternal story, and humans are just a current chapter.
That's right. When this is the way that I view it. When you open up the Bible, Genesis 1, this is not the beginning of the story. This is the beginning of our story, of our role, of our chapter in the story. But the story itself precedes us because it's not about us.
Right.
And I think Christians have a hard time imagining a universe without us in it, which I think that to me, that seems pretty conceited.
Well, the Bible in our story from Genesis, I mean, right away you're getting the introduction of an elder race.
That's
You talk
exactly
about
right.
elder race.
That's exactly right.
And I haven't seen many Christians, you're one of the ones that have spoken most on this and really emphasized where that role is for us, how we relate to this elder race.
Well, it's clear when you read both the Old, but especially the New Testament, the words of Christ and then of his apostles, there's a family. There's a divine family. And Adam was a son in that family in the beginning. When you read the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth, it goes all the way through the post-flood patriarchs into the pre-flood patriarchs, naming each one. Not everyone. It's telescope, by the way.
Yeah.
It goes through the primary players, and it goes through Noah and Lamech and Methuselah and Enoch and Jared and Mahalalel and all of the pre-flood patriarchs, all the way back to, and it's Noah is the son of Lamech, and Lamech the son of Methuselah, Methuselah the son of Enoch, and so forth, right? And it gets all the way to Adam, and it says, Adam, the son of God. So Adam, our progenitor, our father Adam, was a son of God. But that's what we are going to become in Christ.
Sons of God.
Those who are believing in Christ are going to be restored to the family. We're going to become sons again. See, we're given power to become the sons of God, according to Jesus. And the power to become sons of God is called the resurrection. It's the new birth. And so we're going back into the family through Christ. This is the parable of the prodigal son, by the way. We're going back into the family through Christ, and we're not the only members of the family. Because there are other sons of God they're not human. They pre-exist us. In the book of Job, we read that the sons of God shouted for joy, or the morning stars shouted for joy, and all the sons of God sang together, or the other way around. The morning stars shouted for joy, and all the sons of God sang together, while the foundations of the earth were being laid. This preempts the existence of mankind. So there's already a family, right? This language is not incidental. It's not incidental, this familial language.
Why do you think pastors and people of faith have kind of ignored this topic of our family, of our extended family?
Because of the anthropocentric perspective. We're the center of everything, right? We think of angels as just messengers. They're just messengers. They exist to serve us, or to bring us messages, or to serve God in that capacity. We fail to recognize, as I said, that the familial language in the biblical narrative, especially in the New Testament, especially the way that Christ employs it, is not incidental. That language is there intentionally because there's a family. And the gospel of Christ is about the restoration of that family. So we have elder siblings. We are the younger sibling in this family. And our elder siblings, which I denominate in my book as the elder race, because they're older than we are, hence elder, and they constitute a race. Right. These are not just ethereal spirits. These are people, for lack of a better term. They're not human beings. They're an angelic race. And they're everywhere in the Bible. And they always look like us. Rather, we look like them. Why? Because we're siblings. We were created to be members of the same family, but of course, because of the tragedy of the human story is that because of sin and insubordination, we were divorced, sundered from the family of God. That's the tragedy. That's the human condition. We are in a condition in which we are subject to entropy, to death, and divorced from the family of God. But the good news of the gospel isn't, hey, you don't have to go to hell. That's not the good news of the gospel. The good news of the gospel is you can go back into the family through Christ. He redeems you from the swineherd, again referencing the parable of the prodigal son, and he reconciles you through the cross. He reconciles you to the Father. And reconciliation means to be brought back into fellowship or friendship. So we're the enemies of God because of sin, but the cross of Christ brings peace and reconciliation back to the Father so that we might go back into the family.
So most Christians, I think us included, would say the most important thing we should focus on in our walk is the gospel and the message of the gospel. But why is it still important to recognize that we have an extended family that predates mankind? Why is this not some wild rabbit trail that
Because Adam and Eve were not naked vegetable gardeners.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't naked vegetable gardeners. They were sons and daughters in the divine family. They were a son and a daughter. They were in the family.
This is why you call it birthright.
This is part of the reason why I call it birthright.
Yeah,
That's right.
I'm just picking that up even after reading your book twice.
That's right. So our birthright is to be in the family of God.
Yeah.
That's our birthright. And we can't even imagine what that means.
No.
We can't comprehend what that means. It's not about a garden. It's not about a tree. It's not about a snake. It's about the Father's house. That's where we began. We were sons. We were in the family. We had fellowship with the Father and with our elder siblings until insubordination, sin. And so, again, we might as well just go through it. The parable of the prodigal son is, Christ illustrates this in various parables, but the parable of the prodigal son, I think, is the most elegant, beautiful presentation of the gospel in the Bible. And unfortunately, so many pastors miss this. Mm-hmm. But it is the story of the gospel. And we all know the story. That there's a household, right? That's how the story begins. There's a household. And there's the patriarch, the father, and the father has two sons. And there's an older sibling and a younger sibling. And this is where it begins, in the father's house. And the father, it's apparent in the story that the father is wealthy and he has this magnificent estate. And by the way, Jesus says that the older brother and the younger brother are co-inheritors of the father's estate. He's
talking about us and elder.
They're co-inheritors of their father's estate. And so you have the elder sibling, the younger sibling. The younger sibling is the prodigal son, because he goes to his father and he says, "Father, give me my inheritance now so that I can," he wanted to go out and spend his inheritance. And the father concedes and gives him his inheritance. And the son becomes prodigal. He leaves the father's house and he goes out into the world and he wastes his inheritance on wild living. So prostitutes and gluttony and partying and all of that. And he becomes destitute. He spends all of his money. And to make matters worse, there's a famine in the land. So now not only does he not have any money, now there's a famine. There's no food. So he ends up becoming indentured to a swineherd. And the swineherd is the archetype of Satan. So the prodigal son, no money, completely destitute. He has no other alternative but to become indentured. Indentured servitude. In other words, he'll work off whatever he owes to the swineherd. The swineherd will feed him, and the servant will work off his debt. And he's so poor, he's so impoverished that he's eating the slop of pigs. He's filthy. He's eating the slop of pigs. This is his condition. This is our condition. This is the human condition. We are like the prodigal son. And he realizes in the midst of this impoverished condition that even the servants in his father's house are living better than him. And so he concocts this idea. He's going to go back to his father, but he's not going to go back and ask for forgiveness to be brought back in as his son. He blew that. That's done. So instead, what he's going to do is he's going to go back and ask his father if he can be received back into the household, but as a servant, right? He's forfeited the sonship. He's wasted his inheritance. Surely his father is going to be extremely angry with him. And so he sets out for his father's house. And with this plot in mind. And of course, he's thinking his father's going to be very angry with him. But instead, what does Jesus say? What is the Father doing? The Father is daily waiting at the door for his Son to return home. That's the disposition of the Father. He's not angry. He is eagerly waiting for the return of his son, of his younger son. And when he sees his son coming, what does he do? He runs out to him and he embraces him and he kisses his neck. And you can imagine the prodigal son covered in filth, destitute, dying of hunger. And he must be shocked, right? That instead of his father scolding him for wasting his inheritance and sending him away, his father's kissing him and embracing him. And furthermore, the father calls his servants, he calls for them to bring new clothes so that his son is clothed in new clothes and sandals to be shod on his feet and a ring to be placed on his finger. This is all very important. Remember, this is Jesus telling this story. Well, the new clothes are representative of the resurrection. That and also of the sanctification in Christ. See, we exchange our dirty rags for the righteousness of Christ. That's what those new clothes represent. We're exchanging our dirty rags for our sin for his righteousness. The sandals which are placed on the prodigal son's feet, that's very symbolic because in those times it was common for servants to be barefoot, especially in the Roman Empire. Servants, a mark of a servant or a slave was that in many cases they went barefoot. So he's not being brought back as a slave. In fact, there's a ring placed on his finger. This is the seal of the royal house. So what's happening in this picture? This prodigal son is not being received as a servant. He's being received back into the family as a son.
It's restoration.
He's being restored to what he had before he left and blew his inheritance. So he's brought back into the house, and the father calls for a fatted calf to be slaughtered and for a party to be thrown in honor of his son returning. And his older brother's out in the field. And his older brother's hears the commotion in the house, and he calls for a servant. He says, "What's all this commotion in the house?" And the servant tells the older brother, "Your younger brother has returned. And so your father has slaughtered the fattened calf and is throwing a party for him." And the brother becomes incensed. And he goes to his father and he says, "Father, all these years I've been with you and I've been faithful to you. And you've never thrown me a party so I could have my friends over, and we've never slaughtered the fatted calf and had a party." He said, "But this son of yours who blew who wasted his inheritance, he returns home and you throw him a party." And the father's reply to him is the very core of the gospel. He said, "The reason why I'm doing this," paraphrasing, "is because this brother of yours was lost and now he is found. He was dead and now he has been made alive." So that's the gospel of Christ. We are the prodigal son. We are destitute. We are eating the slop of pigs. We are wearing rags. This is the human condition. And the prodigal son recognized his destitution. He recognized his condition. And that's how we receive the gospel of Christ. We recognize our condition, this condition of sin and death, that this isn't what we were made for. This is wrong. And so it begins with repentance.
Yeah, we go to the Father, we humble ourselves before him.
Exactly right. And when we do this through Christ, he made a way for us to go back into the family. In fact, on the eve of his crucifixion, Jesus is with his disciples at the Last Supper. What does he tell them? "In my Father's house are many mansions, and I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go there and prepare a place for you, I will come back and get you so that you may be where I am." And his disciple asked, well, where are you going so that we can follow? He said, well, you can't follow me where I'm going. And they said, well, where's the way? How do we get to where you're going? And Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no man comes to the Father but through me. So going to the Father through Christ is what? Going back into the family. That's the gospel of Christ. And I think that story, that amazing, beautiful story, the most beautiful story ever told, we've lost it somehow.
Yeah.
We've lost it, but that's what it's about. That's what the gospel of Christ is about. It's about through Christ, who redeems us from the swineherd, to whom we are indentured because of sin, right? A price had to be paid to redeem us first.
Right.
That's the cross. And that price being paid and Christ suffering and dying on the cross and being whipped and bruised for our iniquities, that because of that, we can be reconciled to the Father and brought back into the family. See, to me, that is so exciting. It's incomprehensible, the idea that first of all, that God would send his only begotten Son, his beloved Son, to suffer and die for us, but then also that we get to go back into the family because of what he did for us. That's the gospel of Christ.
To me, the family is so intriguing. The elder race is so intriguing. I can't imagine how people can't be intrigued by knowing that we have this older siblings. From what you spent your life researching this. Is there any indication of what this family is about? Like who are they?
So our elder siblings, again, are referenced as the sons of God in the Old Testament. By the way, the Hebrew term for sons of God, B'nai Elohim or B'nai Chai Elohim, the sons of God, is exclusively used of non-human beings in the Old Testament. It's never once used of a human being. It's only used of angelic beings. Those are the sons of God. So again, here we have this familial terminology. They're sons. This isn't figurative. They are literally sons in the divine family. They are the sons of God. And we, again, through Christ, we are given power to become the sons of God, like our father Adam, to go back into the family. So they pre-exist us. They're pre-existent. Remember what, and I would say to some extent, they're preeminent in regard to their nature. And this is entirely biblical. This is what David says in the Psalm. He says that, what is man that you are mindful of him? And the sons of men that you visit them, you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. You've crowned him with glory and honor. So we were created to be a little lower than the heavenly beings, not a little higher than the animals on earth, rather a little lower than the heavenly beings. Who are the heavenly beings? The sons of God. So we're the younger sibling in the hierarchy. And there's nothing unbiblical about this whatsoever. And by the way, these beings are not from planet Earth. We're from the earth. We're earthborn. They're not.
We say older, much older.
I think that this is, and by the way, this is a civilization we're talking about.
Yeah,
So,
not like 5 or 6.
no, this is clearly,
Yeah.
this is a civilization. And they pre-exist us. And they are in some ways preeminent. And again, mostly, when I use that term, I mean by nature, their nature. And they're not just our servants or messengers. There's no reason to have this familial terminology for just servants who exist to serve us. No, this is a family. So they, again, referencing Job again, they were shouting for joy before not just we were created, but before the earth was formed or reformed, depending on how you view it.
Yeah.
So yes, they are, and I'm going to use this term, and I know this offends a lot of people, especially Christians. They are, in every sense of the word, are extraterrestrial elder siblings.
Yeah.
Because the word, people get hung up on
I
these.
say you've used the word extraterrestrial quite a bit, and I actually am fascinated at your use of the word in the book, and it was very appropriately used. it brought a lot of clarity for me.
Well, an extraterrestrial is simply a being whose provenance, whose origin is not planet Earth.
Right.
If your origin is not planet Earth, if you're not from here, then you are, by definition, extraterrestrial. That's it. That's what an extraterrestrial is. And angels clearly, by definition, are extraterrestrial. They were not created on Earth. They weren't born on Earth. They come from somewhere else. Dare I say, in the cosmos, in the universe. Here's another thing we do because of the anthropocentric perspective of the universe. We have this amazing universe around us. You can look through a telescope. You can see the rings around Saturn. I've done it. You can see Mars. You can see the moons around Jupiter. And we have this vast, incredible universe, but we are under the impression, for some reason, that it's empty.
Yeah. I mean, the Earth is like, to some planets, like a speck of sand, a speck of dust.
It doesn't make any sense to me. So we have the fingerprint of the Maker here on Earth. Mm-hmm. He doesn't create one kind of living thing. He creates millions of different species of living creatures on the Earth, diverse kinds of life forms here on Earth. This is the fingerprint of the Maker. What if the Earth is just a microcosm? Mm-hmm. Now, does that mean that the Earth is unimportant? Absolutely not. Again, I stress that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. You cannot minimize the worth of mankind to the Father. He gave his Son for us, and I would never do that. But there's nothing at all that violates the gospel of Christ in the idea that there are other inhabitants of the universe that aren't from here and that aren't us. Nothing at all. If Christ is at the center of this thing, if it's his story, then all bets are off.
Yeah.
I mean, and this could be, there could be unknown eons of time preceding the human species, preceding our chapter in the story.
Well, I think it's dangerous to the faith story to be so hard-lined in that, because now if we do have some sort of extraterrestrial physical encounter, then you're like, well, everything I believed was a lie.
That's the problem is unfortunately, I think a lot of Christians, they don't have a paradigm that's adequate for the realities that are coming. And their paradigms need to be restructured and expanded. Now, you keep Christ at the center. You anchor yourself in the gospel of Christ, absolutely. But some of these other rigid walls need to start to crumble because we've had the wrong perspective. There is nothing whatsoever unbiblical about an extraterrestrial civilization, for example. Nothing whatsoever. In fact, there is an extraterrestrial civilization. It's called the Kingdom of Heaven.
Yes, and intelligent life does exist there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And people can say, no. The Kingdom of Heaven is a spiritual realm. It doesn't matter if it's interdimensional, if it's spiritual, or if it's somewhere in the physical universe. It doesn't matter. The fact is that it exists. It's somewhere that's not here, and it's populated by intelligent beings.
Hey, what's up, Brazilian family? I am so grateful for each of you who tune in every week to hear our episodes. We have such incredible guests and topics that I am passionate about, our team's passionate about, and we could not do it without you. So we're thankful for you. We love you. We appreciate you locking arms with us to be more informed, to become a more resilient community. And I want to invite you to become a tighter part of that community by joining us on Patreon. If you go to our show notes below, you can click the link and get dialed into our Patreon and get extra content weekly. You can join for $15 a month and get behind the scenes footage, get closer access to me. I have monthly Zooms that I'll be doing with some members of the community. And so we'd love to get more involved. Again, go below in the show notes and click the link and join today.